Welcome to this chess strategy review on holes and weak squares. And so for this demonstration, I will be using the game Wilhelm Steinitz, the first unofficial world champion, versus Joseph Blackburne. And the game took place in London in 1876. And so this game begins with e4, e5, a Ruy Lopez opening, and the bishop is attacked, retreats, and knight to f6, and here the pawn is defended. And as we play into this position, we will see how holes in the position and weak squares become an important factor in determining the outcome of this game. And so here c3 is played by white, creating a hole for this bishop to escape to, but that is not quite the type of hole that I'm referring to. Some examples already in the position are d5 here, which is a hole in black's position, although temporary, and f5, where one of white's pieces, particularly a knight, is a piece that will benefit from being placed in a hole in your enemy's position. And these weak squares here are temporary because if a piece jumps to f5 or d5, a pawn could move forward and attack the f5 or d5 square. And so as the game continues, further development by both sides. Here the bishop moved out, preparing the way for black to castle, and h3 is played here to prevent this bishop from coming down to g4 and pinning the knight. And so castle by black, and white moves his queen forward to develop. And then here is a unusual, well, a move that's not played so much nowadays. This is an older variation of the Ruy Lopez, where this knight on f6 has retreated to allow this pawn to push forward to f5 and fight for the center. And so white moves his pawn forward to g4 to prevent this f5 pawn push. But we see here holes and weak squares have been created by this g4 pawn move. Now there's a hole here on h4, but more importantly on f4, where black could potentially try and place a piece here later in the game. And so the game continues with b5 attacking the bishop. Bishop retreats into this escape hole, and bishop to b7, eyeing this long diagonal towards the king side. And knight development, and queen moves to help cover this f5 square. And now this knight is repositioning from d2 to f1, and from here it can jump into g3 or e3, and from e3 it can eye these two holes here at d5 and f5. And so play continues with black also remaneuvering his knight to reposition here to e6, where it can eye this hole at f4. And so the knight jumps in, and from here it can put pressure and jump into these holes on d5 and f5. And black does the same, eyeing this f5 spot here. And white moves in first, jumping to this f5 spot, but this hole is temporary because this pawn on g7 can push forward to g6, chasing away this knight, which is what he does. But now white has caused black to incur a weakness and some weak squares around his king side here. These dark squares are weaker now because there's no pawn that was on g7 that was protecting these h6 and f6 weak squares now. And so the knight must decide whether to retreat or move forward. He moves forward, exchanging off the dark squared bishop, which is a good defender of these weak squares, but now with that gone, black has a long-term weakness around his king side. So queen recaptures, the bishop moves here, developing, keeping an eye on this diagonal leading into the king side, but also covering the d4 square in the center. And so the knight remaneuvers, helping to defend the king with these holes around, these weak squares around the king. Castling on the opposite sides now. So white castles to the queen side, where this rook will eye this d4 square, where he can push this pawn forward and fight for the center. But it also allows his kingside pawns to press forward, attacking the black king position. And so here we have c5 fighting for control of this d4 square. But white pushes forward, fighting in the center anyway, and exchanges occur. And pawns are exchanged. And here black makes a mistake. Instead of capturing in the center, he pushes his pawn forward. He has a pawn majority on the queen side, but it leaves white with more control in the center. And white pushes his pawn forward, forcing black to waste time retreating his knight. And now we have the queen moving to d2, where it can eye this diagonal up to the king side. And as white is slowly building his forces up against the king side, black tries to get counterplay by pushing his pawns forward on the queen side. And now the bishop jumps into d4, eyeing these weaknesses around the black king. And so f6 attempts to block the scope of this bishop aimed at the king. And the queen jumps into this hole and covers these weak squares around black's king. And in your own games, if you ever have the opportunity to force these weak squares on your opponent, then it is a good idea to do your best to take advantage of these holes and weak squares in your king's position. Your opponent's king's position. Or anywhere else on the board. Always look for weak squares and holes in which your pieces can occupy and gain an upper hand on your opponent. Okay, so queen side pawn push by black as he tries to get some counterplay on the queen side, but it is already looking bad for black. His king side has too many weaknesses, and a pawn push by white, attempting to force a decision here with this f6 pawn. And so the pawn pushes forward, but it increases the scope of this bishop directly into black's king side. And so here we have the bishop maneuvering up, attacking the queen. And instead of capturing with the rook and removing some of these attackers, black is hesitant to lose material, and so just moves his queen to try and defend here. But a pawn capture, and also now attacking this g6 pawn, trying to remove the defenders around black's king side. Pawn recaptures, but here a devastating pawn push by white, threatening a checkmate here on h7 and attacking the queen, and so the queen captures. But now the attack continues with the bishop capturing on g7, attacking this rook on h8. And so black is hard pressed here to defend and come up with some answer to these attacks by white. And so he tries to trade off attackers and recapture. Queens have been exchanged, and now this rook is attacking the bishop, but the lines have already been opened towards the king. And so rook to g1, attacking the king. Defense by black, but now we have this other bishop that was eyeing the king side, captures a pawn, and black is just in trouble and losing now. And so black plays on a few moves further, but more material is lost, and the knight jumps in. And so we have these two attackers, the knight and bishop, along with the rooks, which all this together will be unstoppable. And now the rook moves in to occupy this open file. And here black resigned as he was hesitant to play on further, being behind in material here. And so in this game, I tried to demonstrate how holes in the position can be used by your pieces by occupying those holes, and also keeping an eye on weak squares, especially around your opponent's king side, but anywhere on the board where there are weak squares that cannot be protected by pawns. So you can place your pieces into those holes and weak squares, and the pieces will become stronger as they cannot be chased away by a pawn, because the hole has been created by pushing the pawn forward. And so anyway, I hope that you can use this strategy of taking advantage of holes and weak squares in your opponent's position to win games. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and feel free to leave comments and suggestions. Thank you, and have a great day.